The marble floors of the palazzo echoed with purposeful footsteps as dawn broke over Florence in the spring of 1513. Stripped of his political office and bearing the weight of exile, sat in his modest study, surrounded by volumes of classical texts and his own unfinished manuscripts. At 54, the man who had once advised princes and shaped the destiny of city-states now faced the most formidable enemy of all, not foreign armies or political rivals, but the insidious whisper of self-doubt that had crept into his mind like morning mist through the shutters. The letter before him, penned by his friend and former colleague, had arrived that morning bearing troubling news. Young, Medici, newly installed as Duke of and nephew to Pope Leo X, was paralyzed by uncertainty. The weight of leadership had settled upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead, and every decision became a mountain of impossible choices. The young Duke's advisors spoke in hushed tones of his hesitation, his second-guessing, his retreat into the safety of inaction when bold moves were demanded by the times. Set down the letter and gazed out his window at the bustling streets of Florence below. Merchants hawked their wares, artisans hammered at their benches, and children played in the narrow alleys between ancient buildings. Each person moved with purpose, driven by necessity and ambition, yet how many of them were secretly crippled by the same demon that now plagued the Duke of? How many brilliant minds were rendered impotent by the poison of self-doubt? The former secretary to the Florentine Republic had witnessed this phenomenon countless times throughout his years in service. He had seen capable generals freeze before crucial battles, watched skilled diplomats fumble negotiations due to uncertainty about their own judgment, observed intelligent rulers make disastrous decisions because they doubted their initial instincts. Self-doubt, had come to understand, was perhaps the greatest threat to human achievement, more dangerous than any external enemy because it conquered from within. As he contemplated this universal affliction, recalled his extensive study of ancient texts and his direct observation of human nature in the political arena. The writings of Caesar, the campaigns of Alexander, the strategies of Hannibal, all these great figures had faced moments of profound uncertainty, yet they had found ways to pierce through the fog of doubt and act with decisive clarity. There had to be principles, techniques, methods that could be distilled from their experiences and applied to cure this modern epidemic of hesitation. Rising from his desk, began to pace the length of his study, his mind racing through decades of accumulated wisdom. In his experience, self-doubt was not a character flaw or a sign of weakness, but rather a predictable response to specific conditions that could be identified, understood, and systematically addressed. Like a physician diagnosing a fever, one could examine the symptoms of uncertainty and prescribe precise remedies. The clock in the piazza struck 7 as pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write. If Jung could spare 38 minutes of his time, the duration of a typical morning briefing or an afternoon stroll through the palace gardens, was confident he could provide the Duke with tools that would transform his relationship with doubt forever. This would not be another lengthy treatise on governance like The Prince, which he had recently completed, but rather a concentrated dose of practical wisdom designed to inoculate against the paralysis of uncertainty. Part I, The Architecture of Doubt. The first step in conquering self-doubt, wrote, was to understand its fundamental nature. Most people treated doubt as if it were a mysterious force that descended upon them without warning, like a plague or a change in weather. This passive approach guaranteed failure because it rendered the sufferer helpless against an supposedly uncontrollable force. In reality, self-doubt followed predictable patterns and arose from identifiable sources. Through his years of observing leaders under pressure, had identified 3 primary foundations upon which all self-doubt was built. Like a building that could be demolished by removing its supporting pillars, confidence could be restored by systematically addressing these underlying causes. The first foundation was what he termed the illusion of perfect information. This was the belief that good decisions required complete knowledge of all relevant factors and guaranteed outcomes. Leaders afflicted with this illusion postponed action indefinitely, always seeking one more piece of information, one additional confirmation, one final consultation with experts. They convinced themselves that their hesitation was prudence when it was actually a form of intellectual cowardice. Had witnessed this phenomenon during the siege of Pisa, where the Florentine commanders delayed their assault week after week, demanding ever more detailed intelligence about enemy positions, supply lines, and reinforcement schedules. While they gathered information, they strengthened their defenses and secured additional allies. The pursuit of perfect information became a trap that prevented decisive action and ultimately led to military failure. The reality that escaped these hesitant leaders was that perfect information never existed. Even the most successful figures in history, Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Columbus sailing west into unknown waters, the magnificent navigating the treacherous politics of Renaissance Italy, had acted with incomplete knowledge and uncertain outcomes. They understood that waiting for perfect information was equivalent to waiting forever, and that reasonable confidence based on available evidence was sufficient for bold action. The second foundation of self-doubt was the fear of irreversible consequences. This manifested as an obsessive focus on potential negative outcomes and an inability to appreciate that an action was itself a decision with far-reaching consequences. People paralyzed by this fear imagined that by avoiding choice, they could somehow avoid responsibility for outcomes. They failed to recognize that in a dynamic world, standing still while others moved forward was often the most dangerous choice of all. During his diplomatic missions to the court of, had observed how the Duke's enemies often defeated themselves through this very fear. City-states that might have successfully resisted its expansion if they had acted quickly instead spent months debating, analyzing, and seeking guarantees of support from other powers. By the time they finally decided to resist, had already consolidated his position and neutralized their potential allies. Their fear of making the wrong decision had ensured that when they finally acted, it was indeed the wrong time to act. The third and perhaps most insidious foundation was the mythology of natural talent. This was the belief that successful people possessed innate gifts that made their achievements inevitable and effortless. Leaders trapped by this mythology constantly compared their internal experience of struggle and uncertainty with others' external appearance of confidence and competence. They interpreted their own doubts as evidence that they lacked the natural qualifications for leadership, rather than recognizing that doubt was a universal human experience that successful people had simply learned to manage more effectively. Extensive correspondence with rulers throughout Italy had revealed that even the most accomplished leaders privately grappled with uncertainty and self-questioning. The difference was not in the presence or absence of doubt, but in their response to it. They had developed techniques for acknowledging uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, for gathering information without falling into the trap of endless analysis, for accepting the possibility of failure without allowing that possibility to prevent action. Understanding these three foundations provided the first essential insight. Self-doubt was not a reflection of inadequacy, but rather a predictable response to the genuine challenges of leadership and decision-making. Like pain that warned of physical injury, doubt served an evolutionary purpose by encouraging caution and careful consideration. The problem arose when this useful signal became an overwhelming noise that drowned out all other mental processes. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, continued writing, his quill moving steadily across the parchment. The key to managing doubt, he explained, was to transform it from an emotional experience into an analytical one. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by uncertainty, effective leaders learned to examine their doubts systematically, extracting useful information while discarding the psychological poison. This transformation required what called the discipline of questioning questions. When doubt arose, instead of asking, "What if I'm wrong?" or "What if this fails?" skilled leaders asked more productive questions. What specific information would help me make a better decision? What are the costs of delaying this choice? How can I design this action to minimize downside risk while maximizing potential benefits? The discipline of questioning questions prevented the mind from spiraling into abstract worst-case scenarios and instead focused attention on concrete, actionable considerations. It transformed doubt from a paralyzing emotional state into a tool for systematic analysis and improved decision-making. Paused in his writing to consider a specific example that would illustrate these principles clearly. He recalled the crisis that had faced Florence in 1502, whence rapid expansion threatened the independence of the Republic. The city's leaders had been paralyzed by doubt, uncertain whether to seek alliance with France, negotiate directly with, or attempt to rally other Italian city-states in opposition. The decisive moment had come when the newly elected had applied principles very similar to those was now articulating. Instead of continuing to debate abstract possibilities, had asked specific questions. What were its immediate military capabilities? What were the probable responses of France and other powers to different Florentine choices? What were the costs and benefits of each possible course of action, including the cost of continued indecision? This systematic analysis had revealed that while each option carried significant risks, the risk of continued paralysis was greater than the risk of any specific action. Had chosen to dispatch himself as an envoy to, not because this was guaranteed to succeed, but because it provided the best combination of potential benefit and manageable risk given the available information. The mission had indeed succeeded, resulting in a temporary accommodation that preserved Florentine independence during a critical period. More importantly, the process had demonstrated how systematic analysis could cut through the fog of doubt and enable decisive action even under conditions of significant uncertainty. Part II, the weapons against uncertainty. Having identified the foundations of doubt, now turn to the practical techniques that could systematically dismantle them. These were not abstract philosophical principles, but concrete methods that any leader could implement immediately. He thought of them as weapons in an arsenal, each designed for specific types of uncertainty and each requiring practice to master. The first weapon was what he termed the doctrine of sufficient information. This was a systematic method for determining when enough analysis had been conducted to justify action. The doctrine began with the recognition that the quality of information mattered far more than the quantity. A single reliable report from a trusted source was worth more than a dozen conflicting accounts from uncertain origins. The practical application involved establishing clear criteria before beginning any analysis. What specific pieces of information were essential for making this decision? What sources were most likely to provide reliable data? What was the maximum time that could be spent gathering information before the opportunity for action would be lost? These criteria served as guardrails against both premature action and analysis paralysis. They prevented leaders from acting on insufficient information while also preventing them from postponing action indefinitely in pursuit of perfect knowledge. Once the essential criteria were met, the doctrine demanded immediate action regardless of any remaining uncertainties. Illustrated this principle with Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon. Caesar had not possessed complete information about the loyalty of his legions, the response of the Roman Senate, or the military capabilities of his opponents. However, he had sufficient information to know that returning to Rome as a private citizen would likely result in prosecution and exile, while crossing with his army offered the possibility of victory despite significant risks. The essential question was not whether success was guaranteed, but whether action offered better prospects than inaction. The second weapon was the art of reversible experimentation. This technique addressed the fear of irreversible consequences by designing actions that could be modified or abandoned based on initial results. Instead of committing fully to a single course of action, skilled leaders structured their moves as experiments that provided information about likely outcomes while preserving the option to adjust course. This approach required thinking in terms of sequences rather than single decisions. The question was not, what should my final strategy be? But rather, what is the best first step that will give me information needed to choose a good second step? Each action was designed to maximize learning while minimizing irreversible commitment. During the negotiations had employed this technique repeatedly. Instead of making immediate commitments or rejections, he had proposed temporary arrangements that could be expanded if they proved beneficial or quietly abandoned if they created problems. This approach had allowed Florence to test different relationships with expanding power while preserving flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. Principle extended beyond politics to any situation involving uncertainty. A merchant unsure about demand for a new product could begin with a small trial rather than investing everything in large-scale production. A general uncertain about enemy intentions could probe with reconnaissance forces rather than committing his entire army to a single battle plan. A ruler considering policy changes could implement them in limited regions before expanding successful approaches throughout the territory. The third weapon was the practice of premeditated failure. This paradoxical technique involved deliberately imagining and planning for potential failures before taking action. Rather than trying to suppress thoughts of possible negative outcomes, leaders using this method systematically explored what could go wrong and developed contingency plans for the most likely failure modes. This practice served multiple psychological functions. First, it reduced the fear of failure by transforming unknown dangers into known challenges with prepared responses. Second, it improved the quality of decisions by identifying weaknesses that could be addressed before they caused problems. Third, it built confidence by demonstrating that even if things went wrong, recovery was possible. Had observed this technique in the military campaigns of successful generals who always maintained multiple lines of retreat and communication. They did not plan to fail, but they planned for the possibility of failure in ways that made recovery more likely. This preparation paradoxically made bold action more feasible because it reduced the stakes of any single decision. The fourth weapon was the discipline of small victories. This involved breaking large, uncertain challenges into smaller, manageable steps that could provide momentum and confidence. Instead of trying to solve everything at once, effective leaders identified components of the larger problem that could be addressed successfully with available resources and information. Each small victory served multiple purposes. It provided concrete evidence of competence and progress, it generated valuable information about what approaches worked best, and it created momentum that made larger challenges seem more manageable. The psychological effect was particularly important because success in small matters built the confidence needed to tackle larger uncertainties. Had seen this principle applied effectively in military sieges, where commanders who tried to take fortified cities in a single assault often failed, while those who systematically captured outer defenses, supply lines, and communication points eventually forced surrender with minimal losses. The same approach worked in political negotiations, where agreements on minor points created trust and momentum that made resolution of major disputes more likely. The fifth weapon was the cultivation of expert networks. This addressed the limitation of individual knowledge by creating systematic access to specialized expertise. Rather than trying to become expert in every relevant area, skilled leaders identified the most knowledgeable people in key domains and developed relationships that provided reliable access to their insights. This network approach had to be carefully managed to avoid the trap of conflicting expert opinions. The key was not to collect as many opinions as possible, but to identify which experts had the most relevant experience and the best track record of accurate judgment in similar situations. Quality of expertise mattered far more than quantity of advisors. During his diplomatic career, had built relationships with merchants who understood economic trends, soldiers who knew military capabilities, and priests who had insight into popular opinion. This network had provided him with information that would have been impossible to gather through formal channels, while also giving him confidence that his decisions were based on the best available knowledge. The sixth and final weapon was the acceptance of imperfect outcomes. This was perhaps the most difficult technique to master, because it required abandoning the fantasy that correct decisions would lead to perfect results. In reality, even the best decisions made with excellent information often produced mixed outcomes because of factors beyond any leader's control. The acceptance of imperfect outcomes freed leaders from the paralyzing fear that making the wrong choice would lead to disaster. It allowed them to focus on making reasonable decisions with available information rather than trying to guarantee specific results. This shift in perspective was liberating because it made the standard for action achievable rather than impossibly high. Reflected on his own career as an example of this principle. His diplomatic missions had not always achieved their stated objectives, and his political advice had not always been followed successfully. However, his willingness to act despite uncertain outcomes had resulted in valuable experience, useful relationships, and occasional significant successes that would never have been possible if he had waited for guaranteed results. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across his study, realized that these 6 weapons formed an integrated system for managing uncertainty. They were not independent techniques, but mutually reinforcing practices that together created a completely different relationship with doubt and decision-making. Part III, the transformation of character. The clock tower chimed 3 as approached the final section of his discourse. He had identified the foundations of doubt and provided practical weapons for combating uncertainty, but lasting change required something deeper, a fundamental transformation in how one understood the nature of leadership and decision-making itself. This was not merely about learning new techniques, but about developing a different kind of character, one that was naturally resistant to the paralysis of self-doubt. The transformation began with what called the embrace of experimental living. This was a philosophical shift from viewing life as a series of tests to be passed perfectly towards seeing it as an ongoing experiment in which failure was not only acceptable but necessary for learning and growth. Leaders who made this shift stopped asking, "How can I avoid making mistakes?" and began asking, "What can I learn from this situation, regardless of how it turns out?" This perspective was revolutionary because it removed the emotional sting from uncertainty. If every decision was an experiment rather than a final judgment on one's competence, then unexpected outcomes became data rather than disasters. This reframing allowed leaders to take reasonable risks without being paralyzed by the fear of being wrong. Had observed this mindset in the most successful figures of his era. Medici had treated his political alliances as experiments, maintaining flexibility to adjust his relationships as circumstances changed rather than committing irrevocably to any single strategy. Had approached his military campaigns as tests of different tactics and strategies, learning from both victories and defeats to refine his methods for future conflicts. The experimental mindset required developing what termed intellectual humility, the recognition that no individual, regardless of intelligence or experience, could predict complex outcomes with certainty. This humility was not self-deprecation or lack of confidence, but rather an accurate assessment of human limitations that paradoxically enabled more effective action. Leaders with intellectual humility made better decisions because they sought diverse perspectives, questioned their own assumptions, and remained open to changing course when new information emerged. They were less likely to persist in failing strategies out of pride and more likely to recognize when their initial judgments had been incorrect. This humility also made them more persuasive to others because people naturally trusted leaders who acknowledged uncertainty rather than those who claimed impossible levels of certainty. Followers understood intuitively that complex situations involved genuine uncertainty, and they respected leaders who were honest about this reality while still providing clear direction. The second element of character transformation was the development of adaptive confidence. This was a form of self-assurance that was not dependent on being right about specific outcomes, but rather on one's ability to respond effectively to whatever situations arose. Instead of trying to predict and control the future, leaders with adaptive confidence focused on building their capacity to learn, adjust, and succeed under a wide variety of circumstances. This type of confidence was far more robust than the brittle certainty that depended on specific outcomes. Leaders who needed to be right about their predictions were constantly vulnerable to being undermined by unexpected developments. Those with adaptive confidence became stronger with each challenge because every new situation added to their repertoire of experience and proven capability. Had seen this quality in military commanders who remained calm and effective regardless of whether battles unfolded according to their original plans. They had confidence not in their ability to predict what would happen, but in their ability to respond intelligently to whatever did happen. This made them both more flexible in their tactics and more resolute in their overall determination. The development of adaptive confidence required what called the practice of voluntary discomfort. This involved deliberately placing oneself in challenging situations that required quick thinking and decisive action under pressure. Like physical exercise that built strength through controlled stress, voluntary discomfort built mental resilience through managed challenges. This practice could take many forms, taking on assignments outside one's area of expertise, engaging in debates with intelligent opponents, traveling to unfamiliar places, or learning new skills that required risk and potential failure. The key was choosing challenges that were difficult enough to stretch one's capabilities without being so overwhelming as to create genuine trauma. Each successful navigation of voluntary discomfort provided evidence that one could handle unexpected challenges effectively. This evidence became the foundation for genuine confidence that did not depend on controlling external circumstances, but rather on trusting one's ability to adapt to whatever circumstances arose. The third element was the cultivation of strategic patience. This was the ability to maintain long-term perspective and avoid being overwhelmed by short-term setbacks or uncertainties. Leaders with strategic patience understood that most important outcomes developed over extended periods and that individual decisions were part of larger patterns rather than isolated events. This perspective helped them avoid the trap of overinterpreting immediate results. A negotiation that failed to reach agreement in the first meeting was not necessarily a failure if it established relationships and understanding that would prove valuable in future discussions. A military action that did not achieve its immediate objectives might still succeed in gathering intelligence or demonstrating resolve that would influence subsequent conflicts. Strategic patience also enabled leaders to take calculated risks because they understood that the consequences of any single decision were rarely as final or dramatic as they initially appeared. Most situations could be recovered from, most relationships could be repaired, and most failures could be transformed into learning experiences that improved future performance. The cultivation of strategic patience required what termed the study of cycles. This involved understanding that political, economic, and social conditions moved through predictable patterns of change, and that what appeared to be permanent reality was often just a phase in a larger cycle. Leaders who understood these patterns were less likely to be discouraged by temporary setbacks or overconfident during periods of easy success. Had observed these cycles throughout his career in Florentine politics. Alliances that seemed permanent dissolved when circumstances changed, enemies became allies when their interests aligned, and apparent disasters often created opportunities for those who were patient and observant enough to recognize them. The fourth and final element of character transformation was the integration of action and reflection. This was the development of a systematic practice for learning from experience in ways that continuously improved decision-making capability. Most people either acted without reflection or reflected without action, but effective leaders developed the discipline to do both in productive combination. The practice involved regular periods of structured analysis in which leaders examined their recent decisions and outcomes, not to judge themselves harshly for mistakes, but to extract principles and insights that could guide future choices. This analysis focused on process rather than results, examining whether decisions had been made with appropriate information and methods rather than whether they had produced desired outcomes. This systematic reflection served multiple purposes. It helped identify patterns in decision-making that could be improved. It provided objective evidence of progress and capability, and it created a sense of continuous learning that made uncertainty less threatening. Leaders who engaged in this practice developed increasingly sophisticated judgment over time rather than simply repeating the same mistakes or relying on increasingly outdated experience. The integration of action and reflection also required what called the courage of documentation. This involved keeping honest records of decisions, reasoning, and outcomes that could be reviewed objectively rather than relying on potentially distorted memory. Most people unconsciously revised their recollections to make themselves appear more prescient than they had actually been, which prevented genuine learning from experience. Leaders who maintained accurate documentation could see their actual patterns of thinking and decision-making clearly, which enabled them to identify both strengths to build upon and weaknesses to address. This honest self-assessment was essential for continuous improvement and the development of genuine expertise. As the shadows lengthened toward evening, set down his quill and reviewed what he had written. The 38 minutes he had promised would be sufficient for any intelligent reader to absorb these principles and begin applying them immediately. The document provided both the understanding needed to recognize the true nature of self-doubt and the practical tools required to overcome it systematically. But more than that, it offered a path toward a fundamentally different way of being in the world, one in which uncertainty became a source of opportunity rather than paralysis, in which mistakes became information rather than failure, and in which leadership became an ongoing experiment in human possibility rather than a test to be passed or failed. The young Dukov would receive this document within days, but knew that its principles would prove valuable to anyone who struggled with the universal human challenge of acting decisively under conditions of uncertainty. In a world that would only become more complex and unpredictable, the ability to think clearly and act boldly despite incomplete information would become not just an advantage, but a necessity for anyone aspiring to meaningful achievement. Folded the document carefully and sealed it with wax, knowing that he had distilled decades of observation and experience into a concentrated form that could transform any reader who applied its teachings seriously. The art of eliminating self-doubt was not mysterious or complex. It simply required the systematic application of proven principles that any intelligent person could master. As twilight descended over Florence, he reflected on the irony that his own period of political exile had provided the perspective necessary to articulate these insights clearly. Sometimes the greatest wisdom emerged not from positions of power, but from moments of apparent powerlessness, when the fundamental questions of human agency and effectiveness became impossible to ignore. The document would serve its immediate purpose of assisting the young duke, but suspected it would find a much wider audience over time. The human tendency toward self-doubt was not limited to any particular era or culture. It was a perpetual challenge that would require each generation to rediscover and apply these timeless principles of clear thinking and decisive action. The weapons against uncertainty that he had outlined were not his personal invention, but rather the distillation of wisdom that extended back through history to the greatest leaders and thinkers of every age. His contribution was simply to organize this wisdom into a systematic form that could be taught, learned, and applied by anyone willing to practice these disciplines with dedication and persistence. In 38 minutes, any reader could understand these principles. In 38 days of practice, they could begin to master them. In 38 weeks of dedicated application, they could transform their entire relationship with doubt and uncertainty. The choice, as always, was whether to act on this knowledge or allow it to remain merely intellectual understanding. Smiled as he contemplated this final irony, that his treatise on eliminating self-doubt would only prove effective for readers who had enough confidence to act on its teachings despite their uncertainty about whether those teachings would work. The cure for doubt required a small act of faith, but once taken, that act would provide all the evidence needed to justify much larger acts of courage and conviction. The candles flickered in his study as night settled over the city, but the principles he had articulated would prove as enduring as the marble foundations of the palace where they were written. The architecture of human doubt might be universal, but so too were the weapons that could systematically dismantle it, freeing each individual to pursue their highest possibilities with clarity, courage, and unwavering determination.